Here is in detail what the prop spar looks like. You can clearly see the windings that are not really close together but spaced probably at about a 50% spacing. Where it fits the VP hub, I do a much closer spacing on the wrap, but further out I space it much further apart just to save weight. Okay, we'll go over all the materials involved first. Hi, here is the needle that I use before I coat it with Teflon. You can see the part of the taper and the part of the run out at the end at 0.61 millimeters, and the part of 1.35 millimeters, that is where it will receive the VP hub. So that's a constant diameter piece. I built it up with a little bit of CA because the initial rod carbon pultrusion I started with is only 1.2 millimeters, so I had to build it up just slightly. And I will show you how to put the Teflon tubing over top. One thing I also like to mention is the markings on the needle. I made these gold marks and this white mark to clearly show me where the VP hub part is located. So here is a cylindrical constant diameter piece at a final diameter of around 1.80 millimeter. Then from the white mark on, it's a taper tube where the diameter really doesn't matter too much, as long as it's the same on both sides. I found this white mark really helpful because it tells me exactly where I can go from a very conservative pitch on my carbon wrap to a very aggressive pitch on my carbon wrap going forward to save more weight in this particular area. This Teflon is 16 gauge light wall Teflon tubing, so that's PTFE if you're searching it for it on the internet. I cut it tapered on the end so that I can easily get a hold of it with my pliers, and I'll show you how that slides on over top of the, let's find a hole here, other side. Here we go. So this will slide over top of the carbon needle. So now we got a larger diameter. I'll show you how far that is when we're done. So I'll hook up the heat gun. Okay, I'm going to show you here how to put the Teflon over top of the carbon needle. I have a heat gun running and hot at about 1000 Fahrenheit. Then I have my needle with Teflon slit over top of it and pliers on both ends so you don't burn your hands. And here I start to carefully warm up my Teflon. Don't want to go too far with the Teflon because Teflon melts at about 300 Celsius. I don't know where that is in Fahrenheit, but it's quite high for a plastic, very high for a plastic. You can see the dark spot creeping towards the thinner end. Where it makes contact with the carbon, it turns dark. As soon as it makes contact, I move the needle over to the next area. It's no longer doing it now. I have to start pulling harder on the Teflon. It's very easy to overstretch it, especially on the thin end. Yeah, it's not quite there yet. Thin end is always the more difficult part to do. You see it's starting to look a little bit milky at the end. It's hard to prevent that. That's pretty much the limit of how far you can stretch it if you see that. Here, I don't know if it will come into focus here. Yeah, it is in focus. Now you can see the total result. Let it cool down a little bit before you let go of the tension on your pliers, because I'm stretching between these two pliers. Keep the Teflon as tight as I can. Okay, should be cold enough. Now I'm going to have a look at the diameters. Okay. These diameters here are 0.75 millimeters, and here it is 1.5. Okay, now I'm going to go show you the diameters of the needle after the Teflon has been applied. So at the place where the VP hub is supposed to be, I'm at 1.63 millimeters. The final diameter of the tubing to fit the VP hub is around 1.8. So this allows for about 1/10 of a millimeter of wall thickness of carbon. That is not very much, but this is about the right diameter. It could be slightly thinner than 1.63, but that depends on how much you stretch the Teflon. So if you stretch the Teflon more, you'll get a thinner needle. The very end here is at 0.93, and I also have measurements in the past of 1.88. So this is also a relatively thick, but suit yourself. I mean, it's not that critical. Things can be adjusted after. Okay, here we are arriving at how to wind the carbon on the needle. First of all, I take a bobbin with fly tying thread. That's what I use. That's what I had in stock, so that's what I use. And make it nice and visible for you. So I tie that in around the very end of my carbon needle. Okay, and just let it dangle there. Put a little bit of thinned Duco cement over top. Let that dry fast. You don't want to put too much tension on the thread because you will snare in the Teflon. Teflon is very soft, so you want to make sure you don't damage it. This way it'll dry and it will slide off after it dries just as easy as the carbon comes off, so it doesn't do any damage. We cut off the excess so it doesn't interfere with our prop spar. A bit left there. Give that a couple of minutes to dry, and then we'll tie in the carbon right over top. So here I have a piece of 6K toe. It's IM7, so it's a medium. Here I have a piece of 6K toe carbon IM7, medium modulus, so it's not super stiff, not super flexible. This is what I've been using so far. I will probably end up making them stiffer in the future, but I had concerns about strength, so I was a little worried about using M60J. So now that the glue is dry, we're going to tie in a piece of 6K carbon toe. You can use two toes that are 3K. Might be a little bit more cumbersome to tie that on. I like to separate these fibers a little bit so they go around the mandrel much easier that way. when the epoxy soaks into the fibers, the fibers tend to fall apart. It gets a little easier, but when the epoxy is on, it's also much harder to manipulate them. So sometimes you do more bad than good. So here you go. All right, so let's tie this in. Again, I put a little bit of Duco cement here. And right away tie in that carbon on the end. Again, I use very little tension. Try to right away tie them around the entire spar and not pulling very hard on the thread and just trying to make contact. And having a look around. See, it's only, so far the carbon is only on one side, so that's not the best. We really want it all the way around. So I'm going to unwind this for a second and manipulate the fibers more around the entire mandrel. There you go. There you go. So let's have a look at this. Yeah, now it's much better. Good. A little bit more cement. Good. Let that dry. That should work. Okay, we're back. The Duco cement is dry. Cut off the thread, and then we'll take a piece of 1/8 shrink tubing and put that over top and work that while the fibers are aligned as well as possible around the mandrel. Work that towards the end. So it's easier to manipulate the fibers before they have been impregnated with epoxy, so take some time, just be patient with this. Then, because this is shrink tubing, we can shrink it, and I'll take a lighter and I just quickly give it a zap. And now this enables me to pull the fibers nice and straight and keep some tension on there. So as the shrink tubing cools down, it pulls tighter around the mandrel. So now the fibers are nicely aligned. You can still see Teflon tubing, but it is fairly evenly spaced around the entire mandrel. So this is what we like to see. Now I'm going to tighten the chuck of the cordless drill so that we can spin it. I've mixed some epoxy, so I take the epoxy of my choice is the L285 with H285. Most of you will know which epoxy that is. Doesn't require any post curing and gives very good physical properties. This epoxy, when I do quite a few of these spars in a row, I keep a batch of mixed epoxy in the freezer, and it'll last you usually for about 5 or 6 days without any deterioration in the viscosity. Amazingly enough, the epoxy will continue to cure even in the freezer, but at a very slow rate, so you get much more time. So I'll try to even the epoxy out over all the fibers. At this stage we do not worry about having too much epoxy on there, other than we don't want it to drip, but soak all the fibers really well. Good, that should work. Then I have separated a toe, a really thin toe of carbon fiber. This was a 6K toe. I took out this little string, which is probably maybe 1/8, 1/6 or 1/8 of a regular 6K toe. We're probably down to even less than 1K toe in my hand. That's what we're going to use to wrap around the spar. This piece is about a foot long, but 12-14 inches. We'll take as much of the fibers. I'm pulling on it right now. All the loose fibers, take all those off, so there's no hairs hanging off of it. Discard that properly. Then I've pre-cut a bunch of little pieces of tape, and you see I take a piece of masking tape, put that on the end of the toes, then we adhere that nicely to the Teflon tubing, and we spin that together. No, this is not working well. We're going to redo this. A little bit more adhesion to the toe. Try this again. Okay. Okay, squeeze the tape so you get good adhesion. And then a bit of tension on there. Here we go. Now I apply some tension. You can see that the needle flexes. So I apply tension. You can see I don't advance very much in this stage. So now I'm going to come to the tapered part, and I'm going to advance much quicker. In the meantime, I'm ready to grab another piece of tape and put it on the end when I reach the end. So here you go. I'm running out of real estate here. Okay, here we go. Good. So another piece of tape. While I keep this end under tension. So just wrap that around the end. Good. That'll fit. Doesn't look pretty, but it doesn't have to look pretty. It just has to stick to the end. Then, now that the epoxy has soaked into the carbon fiber wrap, we're going to remove the excess epoxy. We want to keep this needle as light, this tube as light as we can, so we're going to remove every bit of epoxy that we don't need and make the fiber epoxy to fiber ratio optimal. I just use a Kleenex, really well absorbent piece of material. You can use a cotton cloth, toilet paper. All these things will really work well with removing the excess epoxy. Give it a bit of time. If you're in a cold environment, even the temperature of your fingers at 37 Celsius will help to thin the epoxy and speed up the process of removing the excess. Okay, that should do it. I've seen people use vacuum to do this, put everything in a vacuum bag. In a really large item, that's probably a very, very good idea. But for these small items, I don't see a need for that. Okay, now we take a piece of sandwich bag. Just a thin of stretchy material. Very thin, stretchy material, about 5/16, so 5 millimeters, 5-6 millimeters wide. And we just, again, attach it to the end. Keep it at tension. There we go. It's ready to go. And then we just wrap that around the entire needle. Trying to not get any wrinkles there. We'll have a piece of tape ready. All right. I'd like to have an extra piece of tape here. Good. No, that should do it. What I sometimes do is I just run my fingers over this, apply a little extra pressure, smoothing out all the bumps. Don't know if it's necessary, but it won't hurt either. Now, this needs to be cured for 24 hours at room temperature before you should attempt sanding it. It won't have a full cure, but it's definitely workable after that. Or you can put the entire needle in your oven and cure it at about 170 Fahrenheit. I wouldn't go any higher because you run the risk that the Teflon wants to return back to its normal original state. And so I personally do not use the oven anymore if I have time. I put it in my heater room on a heating pipe where it's about 50-60 Celsius, and that's my perfect ideal working temperature. And I usually can remove the plastic already after 5 or 6 hours. That means I can make 2 in one day, and that's fast enough. So now that the epoxy is cured, we are ready to remove the spar from the mandrel. So first I have to take the tape off. The skinny end of the mandrel, the carbon is very thin, so it's very easy to break this if you're not careful. So just be really, really cautious there. My tape adheres quite well, so it's usually a bit of a job to get it off. There we go. That should work. Good. Set of pliers. All right. Flat on the table. So I lay the entire mandrel with tube on the table and I press on it with my hand, keep it flat, and you just push very slowly. You pull on the, if it doesn't work, it often works really well, is take a piece of tape and glue it to the table. You don't want to rip the piece of Teflon that you're pulling on with your pliers, because as so that's why you go slow. Go slow. Slowly. There we go. Just pulls right out. Voila. There's our tube. Voila, there's our tube. It's not stiff yet because the resin is still relatively soft, but that should cure up in the next week without any problem. So the end result shows 24 milligrams for the tube, and it is unsanded, so it will definitely be close to 20 milligrams when this tube is completed. So now that the needle is drying, I want to introduce you to my sanding needle. The sanding needle is made out of a piece of music wire and 2 pieces of brass tubing. I'll align it so you can take your measurements. The music wire is 0.8 millimeter. The brass tubing is 1.2, I believe. No, it's 1.6 millimeter, and the larger diameter piece is 2.4 millimeter. Then I have a piece of silicone fuel tubing, and I slide that over top until it friction fits over top of the larger brass end. And then I take my cured needle, yet unsanded, and I slide that into the fuel tubing. So now, when we add the cordless drill and we fasten that into the chuck, have our homemade lathe, and at higher speed I'm able to spin the needle. In the meantime, I've also made a piece of sandpaper and balsa. On both sides on the balsa I have sandpaper, and usually that becomes like a hinging material. What I'm going to do, okay, sanding the needle. I sand the needle with the help of 2 pieces of 1/8 balsa wood, and I glue on there 240 grit silicon carbide sandpaper, and I basically wrap the needle between these 2 sanding pads and sand them until I find the desired thickness. It takes a lot of measuring and interruptions to get it right. I work my way to finer sandpaper up to about 600 or 800 to get a little smoother needle. This needle is removable so that you can also sand the larger end, because this sometimes it takes a little bit of piece of tape on this end to get a little better grip in the silicone, and then you can also, yeah, in this case too, then you can sand this to the right thickness with your VP hub and sand it until it fits nice and snug. If it's too thin, you can add a little bit of CA, thin CA, to the diameter to raise it back up to the required spec. I hope this video was helpful and informative for you, enough to be able to build your own tapered carbon prop spars, and I thank you for watching.